All right, everybody. So welcome. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Good evening in some places. Good night in some places. Good morning in some places. Wherever you are, thank you for tuning in and listening. My name is Quetzal Flores. I'm coming to you from El Sereno, the greater East Los Angeles area. And I am honored to be a part of this discussion today. This group of people who are really important thinkers and doers in our world, and are gonna support this effort today by talking about the idea of building. And so very quickly, I'm going to do some housekeeping. In the event that you want to make a comment, at the bottom of your Zoom, there is a button for Q&A. Please click that button and you can type in your question, and then the moderator and folks will get to it, and then that way we keep this thing flowing. So welcome to the Cancel Rent Fest. This is day 7 of the Cancel Rent Fest. We've been going strong, doing some concerts, some dialogue with different folks, with artists, with community folks. And this is a part of the larger Cancel Rent campaign, national campaign of Right to the City Alliance, who is a national alliance of over 80 housing, racial, economic, environmental justice organizations joining forces with Artivist Entertainment, which I am a part of, to launch a 10-day concert series. And with this crisis of coronavirus, millions of people are unemployed and will become unemployed, unable to make rent and mortgage payments, which is why under this larger program of Beyond Recovery, Homes for All campaign, we're all calling on politicians, on business owners, on homeowners, etc., to cancel rent, to cancel mortgages, and put pressure on banks and on people in power to do the right thing, to support people, to support vulnerable people especially, and make sure that we are safe and we're protected. And so I'm going to hand it over to this wonderful person who will be moderating today. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about some of the people, or I'm just going to introduce some of the people really quick. We have from Australia, but I don't know if you're in Australia, Sam. I don't think so, because it's daytime. I think you're here in LA. We have Sam Cook. We have Vijay Gupta, who's in Pasadena. We have Jeff Chang. I think you're in Oakland, Jeff. And then we have Gay, our moderator for today, Gay Teresa Johnson, who is in Ventura, California. Take it away, Gay.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. It's always wonderful to be in community with all of you, and to all the people who are watching as well. We are so glad that everybody has made the time to come and be part of this conversation, because no matter how we have it, it's important for us to keep it going. And we've always known that as communities who have been marginalized, and often where people have attempted to silence us, but we've always managed to keep the conversation going, whether through words or through writing or through music. And so that's some of the stuff that we want to talk about today, is how do we frame this moment in terms of the radical intersections where our imaginations abide, always have, where we don't need external validation or new prescriptions about what needs to happen for and with our communities, but that we always have the answer inside ourselves. And we look to our own ancestors, to our own practices and pasts, and that we know that this can continue in ways that perhaps we haven't imagined lately, because many of us have misread this moment as a culmination only of white supremacy and not seen it, in fact, as a lot of its downfall. And so much of what we have here today is an incredible power to use that intersection where our imaginations take us, at that intersection of justice and peace and love and the practice and community ritual of regenerating all of the things that have always made us whole. And so I'd like to just say thank you to everyone who's here, but I would like to just maybe start with everyone might be able to talk a little bit about why it's so important that we have this conversation. What are the people and the practices that are calling you to it? And if we could start with Sam Cook, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
So just a way of introduction, I'm Sam Cook. I'm from the Nyikina Nation in the northwest of Western Australia. And to qualify that, we were colonized just a little over 130 years ago. So it's not a long time in terms of our interruption with our cultural continuum. And a lot of our community still is very deep in cultural practice and embody that in their daily life. So my worldview is really framed by that, by having an environment where we were and are and still will be the leaders and masters of our own destinies as communities. I did want to start by saying that this is not a new story. We've heard a number of times from ancestors all over the world that there is a point where the way in which things have been moving is untenable and unsustainable. And in reality, we're at that point now. So I feel quite strong coming from a foundation of ancestors who've gotten us to this point, that as the individuals currently holding the position to move things forward, that collectively the conversation has to be had. How do we move from ourselves as individuals and internalizing the trauma of what this current crisis represents to the power? And I think that just really co-signs and picks up on what you've said in your introduction as well.
Vijay, can we move to you, please?
We can, and I'm wondering if it might be appropriate to introduce myself musically
I think
today.
might be all right. Yeah, please do.
I'd like to play a short excerpt of a piece of music written by my wife, the composer Reena Esmail, and this is a piece that's based on the Hindustani raga Megh Malhar. And today it's raining in Los Angeles, a great blessing that we have rain here. And this is a piece called Varsha, or Rain. And it's based on a tune that you'll hear in the beginning that I'll have a little improvisation upon.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's the best That's the best introduction. I think he's got us beat. Jeff. Jeff, sorry to make you follow that. But
Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, Vijay. Aloha kako, my name is Jeff Chang. I am a writer, and I also work at an organization called Race Forward, where I'm the Vice President of Narrative Arts and Culture, and just really happy to be able to be here with Sam. Thank you to Quetzal, and thank you to Gay, and thank you, Vijay. Great to be here with all of you. I was just gonna maybe start off by saying that, you know, many of us have been thinking over the last 2 weeks about this idea of cultural equity, right? And how that comes up for us in this particular moment. And to know that, you know, before March 1st, that 96% of the funding in the arts went to organizations that do not serve communities of color directly, that only 4% of arts funding in the US goes to arts organizations that serve communities of color. And that actually 58% of the funding goes to organizations that already are having budgets of larger than $5 million. So there's always been huge inequity in the arts in the US, and that it's built actually on a system that was created, really, a nonprofit art system that was created to lift up white supremacy in the 19th century. It hasn't changed. And so what the possibilities are in this particular moment are kind of actually interesting and exciting. If we are going to talk about the hundreds of thousands, the millions, really, 2 million people in the US list artists as their job. If we're going to talk about 2 million people in the US and putting them back to work, we have to take a hold of and understand the questions of cultural inequity in the first place, and to be able to center a lot of those folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, in the efforts to actually move us towards restoring the arts and cultural sectors and ecosystems in the country. So the discussion I think that we want to have in this particular moment and moving forward as we see the fog of coronavirus lifting from us over the coming months, hopefully, is what does that look like? How do we talk about jobs programs? How do we talk about funding? How do we talk about what cultures, what voices have been excluded, kept out of the mainstream deliberately, and how we work to actually undo that moving forward. And I think that that's going to be core to who we are actually going to be thinking about being together as a country and as a world moving forth into this century. The largest cultural equity program was also the largest cultural strategy program in the 20th century, and that was the New Deal, which came because artists organized the cultural front. So they organized basically to be able to create jobs for artists and to be able to move the country to the left. And we have to really begin to be able to think about what that means, I think, as we move into this century and the kinds of things that we have facing us, such as climate justice, such as dealing with racial justice and cultural equity.
I see we have a question right before we get to that. I just wanted to reiterate something that I had said in our discussion previous to going live, which was that lately I've been thinking as a scholar and as somebody who is creative as well about this concept of home. And when we think about Right to the City, we think about all of the ways in which we are going to be put in positions, as Jeff has said, of great imagination around what's next. That we know that because of the histories of the ways that city officials have treated us, that we have got to be ready always to engage with the future, but also to engage very intentionally with what the past has already taught us. And so when I think about home and the city as a space for home and the arts as a practice, then I think about it as more than just a refuge from the ways that racial capitalism affects us all through gentrification and all kinds of violence, climate violence, but instead as a place where we are able to be agents of our own futures and destinies, as a way to remind ourselves that we are more than just subjects of somebody else's ideas about where we're supposed to be, in what spaces we should be confined to. And so I wanted to just say that before I read this question from Scott Macklin, who asks, how do we move toward mutual shared creative economies without reworking and creatively shifting what counts as currency? So I wanted to open that up to anyone who would like to answer.
Sam, you may be muted.
I was, sorry. Look, I think a couple of steps behind all of that is where arts and culture sits in society. In Indigenous worldview, it's center of everything. It's not an adjunct piece that you just place to the side or it has less credential. It is the essential, one of the most important fundamental foundations of a society. And without that, you can look at it from my perspective in a whole range of ways. For example, in a hunting process, without mimicking the animals and understanding how they were and relaying that through your tribal connections, you don't necessarily know how to then gather that animal or protect that animal. So there's a totem system. There's everything that sits within an Indigenous worldview goes back to art and culture. That's one of the most important currencies that's actually not on the table because it's been diminished to a vocation or a curricular activity. It really sits to the side where it's been devalued in this current space. However, they're all needing it right now in terms of one of the big things in isolation is that access to arts, culture and entertainment has been a lifeline, whether people are now picking up books or doing a craft activity or playing music or listening to music or mourning the passing of a number of big lights in the music industry around the world through the virus. There's a whole lot happening on the ground where people aren't really drawing that connection back. So just landing that piece kind of as the foundation of this is the most important cultural currency that we have. The creative economies in Australia at the minute were measuring economic impact. So they were measuring the loss of income from working musicians, for as an example. One of the things that I saw in their methodology was that they were counting a flawed system. So what they were doing was they were counting the pennies and the peanuts that the artists are actually getting and saying, well, this is the economic base that they come from, without addressing the mechanism that is underpaying artists and giving them for the experience or for love, which doesn't ever pay the bills and goes back into the disrespectful nature in which arts and creative industries and activities are viewed across the world.
Thank you. Anyone else have something to add there?
I'll add something. As a musician who comes bearing the sort of trauma of being trained in a conservatory and having spent about 12 years playing in a professional orchestra, I think that our arguments about why we should support the arts have been wrong all along, in the sense that the currency that we have the opportunity to continue developing now is a currency of the heart, is a currency of our own absolutely impeccably honest language of manifestation. Gay, you said this beautiful phrase during our sound check, of generating from heart to community, a kind of through line that is physical. And I see that the way that I turn to my own nourishment in this time is by practicing. And what's amazing is that as someone who has a background in Indian classical music because of my DNA, I'm still trained in the vernacular of Bach and Beethoven. And so I'm practicing Bach every single day. But I'm seeing that our work is to actually decolonize these old dead white composers as much as it is to decolonize our own structures and systems. Because when we actually come back to studying the history of how long this music has survived, A, we see that it has survived in resistance and opposition to every possible system imaginable. B, we've seen that, especially in America, the systems of art have actually been built by those 4% artists of color who have received just that little scroungy bit of funding from the arts establishment, except they need us way more than we need them right now. Because the truth is the entire American entertainment system is built on the backs of Black and brown people. So the truth is that we're the ones who are going to reinvent the philanthropy system that's coming next. So just a +1 to Jeff's notion around the New Deal being not notion, but deep study around being led by artists. And I hope that we see a WPA Works Progress Administration or a CETA style model of supporting artists moving forward. But I think that the physical through line of manifestation is our absolutely authentic artistic practice right now. So the truth is, I feel that this is an opportunity for us to find our own cultural roots so that when a policy gets imposed, it's not top down, but from bottom up, because we've done the work ourselves. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, and I just want to thank the three of you for naming this project of decolonization, because it's so clear, just even in the way that for us to conceive of a jobs program or an economy puts us right up against thinking about racial capitalism, right? That the idea of the creative economy is so thoroughly linked with extractive capitalism, in most cases over the last 2 decades with tourism, right? With literally people coming in to the city in large numbers, right? And partaking of cultural events and then leaving, taking things with them. And we should be pleased with the money and the multiplier effects that happen when these tourists come in and come into our cities and stuff and buy their lattes and that kind of thing. And even Vijay, like starting with grounding us with music and sound that reminds us that there are contexts to all of the art that we create, that we make, that all art comes from place. And then Gay thinking about this idea of the home as not being a refuge from capitalism, but where we are actually constructing the alternative to racial capitalism, the place where we start, right? It feels really interesting in this particular moment that the fact that we're all sheltered in place and on Netflix all the time, or on Spotify all the time, or reaching out in all the ways that we can, because we need that touch with each other. That should remind us of the importance of art and culture and those who are making, bearing, and advancing art and culture in this moment. And so I feel like there's a way in which we can move through this particular moment to be able to regenerate that, going back to Quetzal's idea of this sort of regenerative social imagination, regenerate these commonalities, these connections, these pieces that are restored to us, the need for us to be able to connect, the need for us to be able to reach out to each other and to understand each other. And that serving as a basis of something that moves up to a new world vision, so that when we come back to policies such as a jobs program or something like that, right? That this is not literally about getting capitalism back on its feet, right? It's not about a compromise, which was what the New Deal was, which was about restoring capitalism, but about trying to think about ways in which we can replace it. We can provide alternatives. We can look at ways that economies don't have to be transactive and extractive and appropriative of ideas and cultures, but that they build towards finding our ways of connecting, and that seeds literally our ideas, our movements for change, for things as intersectional and as large as climate justice, and as little as being able to hear a beautiful piece on violin.
When I think about the cultural front that you mentioned earlier, and the fact that we are not trying to create something that is a substitute for capitalism, I think about what that time meant during this incredible upheaval in the 1930s, and what it meant for artists to determine the vision and also the soundtrack of what radical change was going to be. And I think of all of the leaders and the people who remade community in so many different ways because of those soundtracks and because of those practices that happened as a result of people knowing each other's stories and becoming fluent in the language of different kinds of struggles that were happening all over the world. So even though what becomes kind of like the great presentation of the Great Depression and the New Deal is kind of like codified in films that are all about kind of, American uplift and a kind of white-centered, hetero, very top-down understanding of what the democracy is supposed to look like. We have all of these incredible soundtracks and congregations that happen. And then what do we get from that? We get collaborations that people know through their own felt meaning, through their own bodies, between Ella Fitzgerald and Count Basie and Louis Armstrong, and so many different kinds of sounds that emerge from that, but then also the congregations that make possible ballroom dancing and all of the different ways in which people like Malcolm X come together with people who are with Yuri Kochiyama eventually, and all of these different things that are sort of rehearsed, but also embedded in a moment like the New Deal, and not simply because of the New Deal, but in spite of the New Deal. This is something that I'm thinking about now so much too, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Jeff, because we're here again, as we always are, and we also have these answers around how to let the imagination work through us as a living force that breathes in all of us, but also doesn't have ambition in the way that capitalism defines it for us, but instead asks us to have courage and to think and dream beyond any kind of dangers or limitations. So I wonder what's possible right now for us, and what are the radical struggles that we need to become fluent in between communities so that we all get to understand and learn from each other.
I think, again, I'm just going to kind of keep probably stepping back a little step. The value of our intangible cultural heritage is always devalued in these spaces, because when we're coming from a multiplication point of view, it's that connectivity that sits at the back end of these movements of change that I feel would be really valuable to start to interrogate and own and position, and look at the ways in which the provenance can be brought forward so that we aren't learning the canon of the Western space and that being pushed and promoted as the dominant. I feel that layer of intangible heritage, which exists and resides in amongst all of us, from all of our cultural nuance and a collective sum of all of our ancestry as descendants, is a really valuable piece to look at in the broader discussion around policy and change and shift of the paradigm.
If I may tack right onto that, Sam, I think what's so beautiful in how you've just shared what you've shared is that I get a sense of the ownership of that cultural artistic practice in the hands of the people who make it. And I think part of what we need now, or the opportunity of what we get to do now, is to slow down, listen, and reclaim our own cultural practices. And I think that leaning into the discomfort of that for those of us who have only engaged in extractive processes. Jeff, I appreciate you mentioning Netflix and Spotify, the fact that we're turning to art, but we're also still turning to consuming that art that someone else has laid out in front of us. Are we investing enough time in making it ourselves? And I think that the truth is, in an indigenous society and societies of my ancestors, no one decided to put down what the responsible thing they were doing and make art. It was the way of life. It was as natural as our breathing. And so to reclaim that is actually a process inward, I think, as much as a process outward. And to that end, I want to say that I think the immediate sort of view that this is going to go back to normal needs to be thrown out the window. There is no normal to go back to, right? And the truth is that, I wanted to make a point earlier. In orchestra, one of the most sort of celebrated orchestras in the United States is the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. A lot of the musicians are my colleagues. They were the first symphony orchestra, being the highest paid orchestra probably in the world, to lay off all of their employees. They laid off some of the musicians who had been playing in that pit, in that beautiful hall for decades. And immediately they, being Peter Gelb, the CEO of the organization, launched a multi-million-dollar fundraising campaign, of which the musicians get no money. And so we have to ask and have to hold the NEA, who's about to dole out $75 million of funding, accountable, because we know that the biggest arts organizations are going to pay themselves first because their overhead is so high. And we so deeply devalue the artistic process because we devalue artists that right now the colonists are eating themselves alive. And their system is so fragile that it fell apart within 2 weeks of no one being able to congregate in a hall. Maybe a system that fragile deserves to fall apart. And the truth is, maybe we have the opportunity to rebuild it right now, but that actually requires that we sit down and listen to the stories of our communities, but maybe even before that, listen to the stories and find the stories of ourselves through our own artistic practices and processes, so that that process becomes authentic.
I'm wondering if I'm really curious from the four of you, what you're seeing happening now in your own work, and if you could also talk a little bit about your work too, and what's kind of happening. Going back to Gay's question, like where are the flickers of hope? Where are the sparks of change that are, where are they occurring, and what do you see happening in the work that you're doing on a daily? And that's a question too for you and you, Gay, and you, Quetzal, as well.
We're looking at you, Quetzal.
Go ahead, Gay. I want to hear you first.
Okay, you really did that to me. Okay, that's well, I mean, I'm really inspired by the awareness that people have right now about all of the things that have been laid bare by this catastrophe. I was talking with Gilda Haas recently. We were talking about how LAUSD all of a sudden is made to reckon with the fact that most of its students are students of color, the ones that need free lunch. Like, it's so clear that now you have to provide free lunches to everyone, now that you must abide by things that for us have always been about dignity and human rights, and yet for them have always been about the bottom dollar. Now all of these things are laid bare. And so this is kind of, this is an inspiration for me, because these things are laid bare across the spectrum of our society. We can see all of the ways that democracy has been the word itself has been so abused and hijacked to mean any number of things, but never anything really for us. And so to see the kind of then mutual aid that is created amongst folks so quickly. I mean, a lot of these structures have been in place, obviously, for as long as we've ever existed, always. And I'm so grateful also, Sam, you know, when we talk about our right to live in these spaces and in these cities, we also have to, of course, acknowledge that we are on land that of people who were dispossessed. And so even that sort of through line, coming back to that, and that understanding that we have in our bodies and our practices is now, I think, coming to bear and is so important as we begin to start to sort of go into a sort of automatic mode of helping each other and identifying needs and creating opportunities, advocating on behalf of people who are being evicted, advocating on behalf of people who are never going to see a penny from any kind of stimulus because they're undocumented and still under the racial terror that is exacted by ICE and by this administration. And it's an ongoing kind of reality that nonetheless, in spite of that, we see ourselves going into a kind of motion that is really generated from the heart, and that is all about trying to uplift and help each other to be selfless. Those are not things that we've learned under racial capitalism. Those are things that we've learned as a matter of survival, but also as a matter of thriving and a matter of creating something dynamic and a way of regenerating in times that are actually supposed to be sucking us dry. And so this is a time for us to rest and to be in that moment, as we not only prepare for what's next, but to engage with what is at this time. So I'd say passing the torch to you, Quetzal.
Yeah, wow. So right now, the faces of all the folks that I collaborate with on the daily are coming to mind. Co-workers who are getting laid off from nonprofit organizations, other people that I know that are getting laid off. And then there's the street vendors that I have the pleasure of working with that are not able to work right now. And, you know, they're part of that, you know, that gigging economy, you know, they need to be out on the streets selling food or doing their thing, and they're not able to do this. And so to be on phone calls with them and them holding me accountable and them holding hope and reminding us that, you know, to quote Jeff, "We gonna be all right," you know, this is like the privilege that I have to be able to be in the space with folks who've been through some shit. They've been through some crazy times and are still able to maintain that focus and hope and drive and are pushing and you know, laying out frameworks and systems for themselves to be able to move forward. I think about the land trust, the community land trust that I get to work with, Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre in Boyle Heights, and all those folks, and hearing those conversations that they're having currently about acquiring land, about collectively stewarding land, you know, and taking it out of the extractive market. I look at the folks in El Sereno here in the small neighborhood that I live in, taking over these homes that Caltrans has had for decades empty sometimes, and saying, oh, you know what, we need homes, and we're going to take these over, and we're not asking anymore. That's it. You know, the time has come. And that shit to me is like, okay, they're moving on it already. That's the future, right? It's not nor permission, nor perdón, like no apology, no permission. You know, we're doing this, and you're gonna have to deal with us. And so those are really the examples that I'm seeing. There's one more, and that's folks at they call themselves Campos de Cultivo, and it's a group of farmers. Don't call us gardeners, we're farmers, right? And they are designing their future and how they want to be able to grow food, share the information with other people, and make this food available to as many people as possible. And that's it. right there. I mean, the pieces are all there for what Jeff mentioned earlier, that ecosystem, right? In what we call an ecosystem of cooperation versus this competitive ecosystem, you know, ecosystem of cooperation and solidarity. And so that's where I go with this.
And I think you raised a really good point there, because the Western mechanism always others us and places us in these silos. So we're in a very specific silo of race or identity, because they push you to fill the forms in and identify in the way in which they want you to. For me, I'm really fascinated by that. I did write something about that yesterday, which was as one of 2 Niganers in the whole of the United States, where do we sit? We don't in their model, but we do because we're here at the table with our cultural authority, looking at your cultural authority, and we're all saying, this is where the starting point is. And I think moving and addressing some of that is also leads me to a call I did when I was leading the SOS Black Australia campaign, which was an action of activism against the Australian government. What I did was I called out for people to think about what it is in their own capacity. And we all have very different capacities and abilities, and pulling that tapestry together in a way in which we can all contribute to this change is recognizing that some of us have strength areas in other places than other people. And it might just be that, you know, somebody from a specific community can get that message out to their community, and that's their piece. Acknowledging that each piece, no big or small, no economic or low economic, is of more value than the other, because in this cooperative model, we need to look at addressing that inequity. And some of the richest people I know aren't economically rich, they're culturally rich. And so that value rises in our models moving forward, to say, we see you and we place you in this scheme. As you said, we're not gardeners, we're farmers. You know, that whole ecology of what that represents, all that transmission of cultural knowledge on how to be caretakers of country and land and provide for your communities, valuable. Again, it sort of ties a little bit back into the intangible heritage piece. But just to kind of pick back up on Jeff's call, so what's been happening in Australia has been a really interesting space of continued sedation. The government has a very strong place in the world of Australia, and it's a dysfunctional government. So people are waiting to hear from a dysfunctional leader who is a businessman who fashions himself on the current incumbent government of the United States. So the Mini-Me 45 is not providing the adequate resources, and in fact limiting those resources to community. But what's also happening is they're trying to hold on for dear life to their superiority in their mind and you know, their illegal occupation. So within Australia at the minute, what I'm seeing is all sorts of conspiracy theories flying around Indigenous people's world's view right now, which are race-baited, especially against Asian communities. So addressing that directly with our community is something I've been really proactive online to do, because it's intolerable and it diminishes the history that we have as communities coming together in our own cultural authority, to which there are many, many, many examples within our communities. The other one is obviously just silly stuff like the 5G network, which we're on right now. They think it's gonna, you know, kill everybody. This is just government agendas playing out, conspiracy theories playing out, and infecting people in a way in which the sedation and the inaction then continues, because once they're a controlled community, you have the ability to continue to control them. So within Australia, and not separating community from arts, because as I said, arts culture drives everything, we're looking at pushing back our sovereign right, because we've never had a treaty in Australia. So we aren't indentured to Australia, much to their surprise, I believe, once our communities start to separate out and do our own economic runs. We're also embracing technology and methodologies on the ground. So in a practical sense, if you're working with a specific collaboration in a community, making sure that in the arrangements that there's a percentage of economics that always returns to the community, or the patent sits within that community, so it's not then co-opted and taken and become a whole nother thing, because again, valuing intangible heritage becomes really vital in those places, in the same way as that the farmer has all that intangible heritage, which is not something you can go to a Western space to understand at all whatsoever. And when they cherry pick a lot of cultural elements, it always comes out jumbled anyway. So that's kind of just a bit of taking the temperature back home in Australia. Obviously, I'm in LA at the minute, but it's keeping close quarters on how we rise through this and start having our own dialogues. And at the moment, they're really, you know, just very small pockets of illuminated kind of thinking and discussion around how we move out of this, because people are still waiting for the government to provide the solution and the platform to move forward.
I draw a lot of the inspiration and information of the work that I get to do as a musician from people who are impacted by houselessness and incarceration here in Los Angeles County. And the truth is, I think similar to the way that Quetzal mentioned being held accountable, I am being held accountable, my organization is held accountable by the audiences of people who we are in dialogue with, who are truly do not, they refuse to be called audiences, in the sense that individuals who are in reentry from decades in prison are asking us how we're doing, asking us how we're coping with sheltering in place, asking if we have an idea of what solitary confinement feels like. And they call us out on feeling like our egos need to be fed right now in a way that is about us being the hero and we can't leave our own houses. And so the idea of there being an externally imposed validation of ourselves goes right out the window. You know, we have to find a new model of engagement. And so, you know, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how seeing the history of the arts, you know, Gay, you mentioned Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, every one of those artistic entities from the 1930s were co-opted by white entertainment industries. It will happen again. And I don't think that a lot of the colonial arts institutions from the $5 to $100 million range are sitting by idly right now. They are crafting strategic plans that are about community engagement and to continue the lip service of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm wondering if we need to come out with a more clearly stated, culturally informed, culturally relevant practice of saying that there is no diversity without discomfort. And there is no equity and inclusion without wondering if you still have a seat at the table, or rather that it's time for you to leave the table and to let the ones who actually built it have their place at it. The ones who continue to build it have their place at it. And so it's to say that I think it's important for us to remain vigilant in the face of these organizations coming back when things are normal again and claiming federal funding, NEA funding, California Arts Council funding with the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion with zero structural change. And so I come back to being informed by the Skid Row community of Los Angeles, who last I heard had a total of 9 tests done for a community of thousands, over 3,000 people. And yet who have not seen a massive outbreak right now because Los Angeles Community Action Network installed hand washing stations on every single block in Skid Row. So right now, our neighbors in Skid Row are taking care of themselves. And so it's to say that when we get to go back as musicians who make music in that community, we're expecting to be asked the question, well, where the fuck were you? You know, where were you when this was going on? Where were you setting up the hand washing stations? Where are you in the terms of this cultural conversation right now? Because you're not part of the culture right now. And so I'm grappling with what it means to be separated from a community through which I take my information and my meaning. And it's a heavy question to grapple with. And the place where I have to return to is my own artistic practice.
It's also a really great opportunity to talk about the ways that organizing is often very ableist. I mean, we don't think about the folks who have always organized in this kind of digital space. Well, not always, but you know, in recent years, that there have been folks who are confined in one way or another, but who have refused that confinement through an expansive understanding of how they are connected. And so I'm just inspired by what you're saying, is that, you know, this idea of like an immobility, that whether we feel it because of the ways that we're taught to understand what's possible for us, or whether we impose it, or whether we're victims of it, or whatever, there are always people who are expanding this notion of what it means for us to be able to be active in these times. And so especially folks who are part of the disabled community have so much to teach us if we want to listen. Other folks?
Yeah, definitely, I think, again, agency of voice. And so communities coming together mean that we have to accommodate all sorts of linguistically diverse modes of communication. I think one thing that you touched on in the digital space is something that was really familiar to me. Coming from that experience in SOS Black Australia, it was using the technology that we have available to us in the way in which we can, but not limiting it to that platform. So we knew that we had boots on the ground with people who could get to actions all around the country. We knew that we could hold a virtual protest for people who are isolated or contained or couldn't get to those actions. We also knew that in remote areas, people have poor telecommunications. So we were able to use every platform available to us, including faxes. You know, so we're going slow tech and new tech because the inclusive part of this was really important. We made sure we activated linguists so that words and dialogues could be translated, and that go two-way directions, because when you're trying to decolonize yet use mother tongue from England, you're not necessarily having the most robust dialogues that you need with the philosophers and the big minds who sit in languages other than English. So being multifaceted in the way in which we do communicate and giving time and space, because sometimes waiting for a translation in a forum takes a little minute. But if you go ahead with that action without it, you're getting yes, no, cut and dry answers for people's best of their ability to meet this, you know, contrived requirement of assimilation. I think they were really vital for us because we were starting to hear from people from all around the world in some of the most remote places of the world on a common bond, and the bond was humanity at that point. So knowing that we've got one of our biggest capabilities being speaking to our community, starting as the individual, as we've said, moving to our local family group, moving to our community more broadly until we have the bigger dialogues. This was a philosophy that came out of a man called Les Coe in Australia, La Munro, and it was really awakening, because while we're having this ability to communicate, we sometimes forget that we need to be more open to the way in which we do that. And it's powerful when we step back from decolonization in that way, I feel.
I see a question here that we haven't answered. Who do you see as providing leadership? I guess we've started to answer this. But maybe what steps to embrace saludogenesis, which is a process of moving towards flourishing and well-being as a shift from extraction models, such as pathogenesis, which is the disease and biological mechanism that leads to a diseased state. I wonder if anybody had any response.
One of the things, so in my day job, we do a lot of stuff around narrative, and one of the things that's so interesting is how the idea of equity functions metaphorically, metonymically, in this particular moment, right? That that even as as 45 was acknowledging the importance of pivoting towards recognizing the threat of COVID-19, that he at the same time needed to find a culprit, and began using the term Chinese virus the same weekend that he decided to become the hero of the free world, so to speak, and draw everybody's attention to the threat of COVID-19, and to note that the sort of logic of building walls higher and higher, and scapegoating people, and not wanting to take responsibility and continuing to assign blame is actually the exact opposite of the way that one goes about treating a mass disease, right? An outbreak, that you have to actually go to the people who have been impacted the most, which is the definition of equity, right? That's the definition of justice, is to do right and make whole those who have been most deeply affected. And that just continues to play out. And I'm hopeful, I'm cautiously hopeful that that's one of the learnings that we all kind of bring out of this, is that on a daily basis, the idea of folks coming together with proper physical distancing, right, to catch up with each other. Like I feel like my neighborhood has been re-energized in so many ways. My neighbor comes out at sunset and plays the bagpipes, and we all gather in the street to catch up and talk with each other. I'd forgotten just how funny some of the old folks around the block are. You know what I mean? Just those kinds of things are amazing, and the ways in which people are remembering, like, we need to be looking out for the person who lives alone over here, and those kinds of things. So I'm hopeful that in little ways that adds up to that connects up to the bigger learnings that that both of you were talking about, Vijay and Sam, and in terms of the ways in which we have to think about all of the relations, not just the ones that move us towards the most quickest payback within whatever kinds of system that we are working under the illusion of at any particular moment. So I'm very interested in that, in the notion that people know how to come together in times of crisis. This is the point that you've been making, Gay, from the top, that we've got ancestors to be able to draw upon their histories and the models and how they came through things, and that our kids in the same way can see us modeling that as well.
I just want to add an observation briefly to this, is to say that, how empty now the conversation of metrics and scaling seems with regards to artistic practice. right? What bullshit that's been the whole time, right? I mean, how on earth could you talk about scaling the bagpipe experience so that a funder gives a fuck about it? You know, excuse me, but I mean, that's the thing, is to say that no one is talking about that level of extractive metrics right now, because our relatedness is filling us, is fulfilling us, is nourishing us, right? And I feel like that's something for us to really just hold up and enjoy and drink from, you know, in this moment. Because the truth is as well, like, I can't scale the hour it takes for me to warm up my body so that I can practice Bach. All that it takes is for me to show the fuck up the next day. That's all it takes. I have to keep showing up, right? So how do we keep showing up to the process of our own liberation? Right? How do we keep showing up to that process again and again, where the questions matter so much more than the answers, right? And how are we actually keeping track of asking better questions the whole time through, and so that we build that confidence in our ability to question, so that when it comes time for us to ask that one question that will topple this structure that seems to not exist anymore, but is going to come back in full force and say, hey, we've been here the whole time, we're here to help you. To say, yeah, okay, well, then we have these series of questions for you to ask what your values are, to ask what you did during this time, to ask how you created your own cultural mechanism that I can actually be in dialogue with. Because if you're just coming to me with the dollars, well, guess what? My artistic practice has been intact for the last 6 months. You know, so there's that piece. But I just want to say, like, I really look forward to having the de-scaling conversation. You know, even with regards to all of the, you know, vast ways we're able to network through the internet connection right now. I'm trying to build programs that are even more local. Like, a success for me is when 3 folks from the Weingart Center call in via Zoom because they actually figured out how to use their cell phones after being incarcerated for 30 or 40 years. And like, that's a win. I mean, we're so lucky to have Quetzal and Marta and Sandino, his family, share some music with us at our program called Music for Change, which is for folks who are emerging from life sentences in prison. And we had 3 participants join us in this project that's usually between 15 or 20 people every single week. And I was ecstatic because 2 more people figured it out than last week. So the relationships matter more. The relatedness matters more.
Thank you. I'm so invigorated by what you've said, because again, it comes back to this question that Sam, you were talking about around value. I mean, what is valuable? And we're always talking about numbers and what matters. I mean, I thought it was just a stunning revelation last week when the University of California decided that SATs don't matter anymore, right? And that, you know, letter grade minimums don't matter anymore. Oh, and the GRE won't matter anymore either for grad admissions, right? Because once all of this again is laid bare, it becomes clear that revenue was always the only driver, right? So now we get told, oh, those aren't actually good measures of whether you're smart or not. But you know, we've known this, right? We've always known this, and we have always tried to help our own people and ourselves to unlearn these patterns of valuing ourselves by some other measure, by some other scale. And now here it is, and it's so stunning. And we have to keep kind of like lighting on those things and lighting them up, the hypocrisy, but also the affirmation, the beauty of our own definitions around brilliance and joy and contribution and value and scale, of course. Yes, thank you so much for that. That means so much.
But maybe the scale of something different, like the scale of all of our yearnings for something different, right? Like, as opposed to the scale of building a system that is unsustainable, the scale of building a system that's sustainable is what we want to get at here.
I think there's some really nice examples in Aotearoa with our Māori whānau. They have a beautiful model, which is holism. It's about the essential services that wrap around all our communities actually coming together. So we're not sending our elders off in different directions, constantly chasing these solutions or the bureaucracies. It's actually pulling it back forward, so it makes it less important. What's important is what they get at the end of it. And part of that is measuring, as you said, the smallest engagements of the elders sitting together and, you know, singing in song. That's more valuable than filling the auditorium with 15,000 people because you want to make money off culture in that respect. And I feel like sharing our knowledge space in and around all our cultural value becomes really important currency if we want to talk about what currency looks like. It's how we do that mindfully, respectfully, and in a way in which it elevates and uplifts our communities, because we've always held very strongly that we are actually the solution here. And the reason why we know that is because genocide is such a strong mechanism for them to stymie the solution. You know, if they can kill us off, reduce our numbers, then displace us and, you know, create all of that dynamic around who we are as rich, culturally rich people, then they hold, you know, in their minds the power. And I believe that holding their power in that way is the false narrative that people are subscribing to. And I just wanted to say, fuck FICO, you know, all of that mechanism of the insurance scam and the not creating equity for people over here in terms of their medical needs, and, you know, throwing money at in the wind for something that doesn't even exist. You know, insurance is a contrived system. There's better ways to do this. And so when I hear people asking 45 about bailing out the insurance company, I'm like, fuck them, because quite possibly everyone who's got this level of insurance, it's not covering this anyway. So everyone's still in the same situation. So when you take away all of the, you know, the food issues within our communities, the health issues, the well-being, you're coming together in a functional society where the youngest to the eldest person has a very key role in that economy and that ecology in a way in which it doesn't exist in a Western space. That was me handing it over. Just.
I'm wondering how people are feeling about the time that we have now. We've said a lot of really amazing things. Do we have, kind of in the spirit of what BJ said, some questions that we want to throw out? What are questions? I mean, some dreams, some visions, in that spirit of asking more questions than having more answers, maybe.
To encourage visions and questions, I'm also happy to spin out some more music if that's of any interest. It's just an offer, but also happy, just offering. I'm seeing a thumbs up from Gay. Yes, okay, maybe just 2 minutes.
The biggest gift, absolutely.
That was beautiful, Vijay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a question. And to add to what you were saying, Vijay, I had the pleasure of hanging out a lot with the Zapatista folks, communities in Chiapas, Mexico. And one of the things that they say always is, wherever or anywhere in the world, the questions are the same. And only through an organized collective can we respond to those questions intelligently. So my question would be, or is, what are the cultural superpowers in your community, including yourself? Look at yourself, and include yourself in that question. What are those superpowers? And then, once we lay those out, there's going to be some more questions, but that's where I would start.
Again, just coming back to some of the experiences that I've stepped through, which were really strong foundations. How do you lead from the ground up? One of the things that we find a lot in our communities is that appointments in positions are usually driven from the mechanism that either represents you well, fairly, or misrepresents you, or government. So what we did in a project many years ago was to develop a model in which the communities could nominate who they wanted as their representation. This became important because within Australia, there's 800 tribes. So how do you get 800 people in representing 800 nations together to have a dialogue and a conversation? This model was really with 14 nations coming together, and by giving the communities the power to have the conversations, to work through their own fair process to nominate the person who would best represent them to speak on their behalf and hold the same amount of time without stealing daylight from anyone else, was something that they took on very seriously. People got organized at such a local level that was important, and what we were able to provide as an arts organization at that time, I was a theatre practitioner, was to give them the space, so the safe space to do this, to make sure that they had in play, because we all know that within those mechanisms, there's also the opportunity for nepotism and ways in which they could be corruptible. So they were holding their communities accountable. They nominated the people to represent them. The information was getting back to the communities. The projects of engagement grew and grew and grew, but it was led from the ground up. It wasn't dictated by who do we know in the community. It was the community know the community. So let them determine who is the best person within that space to reflect that. And by giving that capacity, it was getting everyone to come together on common questions. So being a younger person who isn't in my community culturally ever necessarily going to be an elder, I'll just be an old black fella. That gave me a bit of opportunity to then make sure that we had the right players in the space, so that it was the most senior from this particular family group, or how do we engage in that? Because a lot of the time you're dealing with spaces that are full of trauma and that really don't have a lot in the Western paradigm. So it was about alleviating some of that, the pain and the pressure of that. And also intertribal conflict. There was all sorts of things that were going on at the back of house, but creating and opening that space for the dialogue and standing there and sometimes just taking it. A great example was we were about to, use the Western tools of a PowerPoint presentation to run through this amazing event. And the first thing that we did was there was a room full of engaged all ages women, because it was a women's specific focus. Everyone started fighting, and they came at us and they came at each other and everyone walked out. And so we sort of stood there, myself and my colleague, and 15 minutes later, everyone came back in and they said, right, let's go. And they said, we also just want to acknowledge that you do this great work. If we can just put the hat around. And that day, gold coin donations of $120 came through to pay for the cups of teas and, you know, the refreshments and things. And that was the community deciding that that's what they wanted to do rather than us determining everything. And it was okay. It was okay to sort of stand there because we were standing in a level of truth and we were standing in a level of our own cultural authority and standing in our own power and acknowledging that sometimes we need to create a moment in time where our communities can vent and then heal and then push forward. So that's just one example of a way of leading from behind in many respects and leading from the ground up to an amazing results.
I'm reticent to lean into your invitation, Quetzal, of claiming myself as a superpower in my own understanding. And perhaps that's part of the issue, is that, you know, we've been so conditioned to deny the wisdom that we've built, wisdom that we carry, but because we've also been lied to and told that we are who we are as individuals, and not that we are who we are as informed by our communities and as informed by our ancestors and informed by the network of people who hold us up all the time. So I'm still dealing with that. But I will say that, you know, the superpower that I think about are my colleagues, are the musicians that I get to work with. The superpower is the community that is galvanized around music that has nothing to do with who pays them for the gig. It's the community of people who are there by the quality of invitation. And so it's to think about what are the qualities and values we embed in invitations that actually don't say, well, invitation is come if you want. No, invitation is come because there are stakes involved in the invitation. There is a reason why your voice needs to be at the table. But I also think about artists who have been doing this work for a very long time. And Quetzal, I mean, you know who this person is. Perhaps others who have worked in LA know about the visual artist, J. Michael Walker, who's been a dear friend and mentor of mine. He created a project here in LA called Todos los Santos, All the Saints, which is an incredible project. And J. Michael talks about, I started something every day at 5 p.m. I do something called Artist Office Hours, where it's just a Skype call. It is that safe space of gathering. It's a small group from anywhere from 5 people to 11 people, and we start and end by singing, and we just talk about where we are. And they've been mundane conversations of, man, I decided to go out for groceries today and I'm fucked up about it. And then the other thing is, I've been trying to reframe who gets to decide what my definition of my self-worth is. And one thing that, you know, J. Michael shared in all of his wisdom is that all of what we do as artists is a gift. All of what we do is a gift. The moment that we decided to let any capitalist system come in and interrupt that gift and commodify it is our own undoing. And so it is actually up to us to reclaim that gift. And I'm also referencing the work of scholarship of Lewis Hyde, who wrote The Gift and Trickster Makes the World. And, you know, this idea of the gift economy that we've talked about is, I think it lends itself to the community conversations. You know, the moment that we realize that in giving a gift away, it actually is like something being born, a labor being delivered. That's the ultimate act of actually laying it as an offering. And, you know, the hope that it's nourishment, not the hope that you get paid for it or that somebody else puts their value on it. So I think I put the superpower aspect in, you know, who are the people who are giving without any expectation of return? Who are the committed people right now? And perhaps it's because of spending, you know, more time than usual in isolation, but I think about everything nowadays with regards to self-reflection. Like, what are the commitments I've made? where can I call myself on my own bullshit? Where have I contributed to being part of the very same problem that I say I'm trying to undo? And how do I take this time to decolonize myself and to undo those neural wirings within myself? And I'm starting to, try to work out more and meditate more and practice. And thank God I have someone who I live with who calls me on my bullshit almost every moment of every day. So I'm really grateful for that. My wife is absolutely the cultural superpower in our house.
Sorry, I just wanted to just quickly jump in, and then I'll jump straight out again. I heard a really powerful wisdom keeper called Mindahi at one of my festivals in 2018 described that arts isn't a gift, it's our responsibility. And that just leveled me, because I'd never until that point, you're always told you're gifted, but if this is your deep down responsibility, how do you shift and shake and change it in that view? Because you then have ownership to do that, rather than to sit back and kind of take it from the external, whereas you're gifted. So I've been given something, but you've been given something that is a responsibility for you to then push outwardly, and own that space. So I'm just throwing that out there, and I'll jump back off. Over to you, Jeff.
That's beautiful. That resonates with something that I was thinking about in terms of the folks I'm lucky enough to be able to collaborate with and work with in this particular moment, which is sort of this notion that if you do have a responsibility in that way, that you better take it up, that you better be brave enough and courageous enough to be able to take it up and to do that, and to know that the folks that I've been lucky enough to be able to be in community with have been taking it up, and to see their bravery on a daily basis has been really, really inspiring in this particular moment. And the other things that kind of came to my mind as both of you were talking were like Sam, your discussion of how to make democracy, the decision making, the will of the community manifests. It reminded me that none of that could have happened if people weren't caretaking trust, right? It sounds to me like folks were like, we can't do this, and then 15 minutes later they come back because they realize that they've committed to each other and that they have a deep level of trust that they have to honor, and so there's a piece there that they have to be able to make pono, right? Like in Hawaiian, the word pono is it's balance, it's sort of rightness, it's justice is sort of the way that I think of it. And then that resonated for me too with what you're saying, Vijay, about this idea of the exchange, right? And the idea of giving art, not necessarily expecting something back from it, but also knowing that particular piece, that gift that is given, or that responsibility that is shared, is something that is an act of a deep sense of generosity. Like I want to share this with you, and the sharing continues. If I've received a gift, it may be affecting me for the rest of my life. And how do you fucking measure that, right? How do you put that into a metric? You can't, right? Like you just can't do that. And that all the anti-racism that we're doing, all the work that we're doing for justice is in that way this huge act of generosity from people who are refusing the gift or refusing like what's being shared a lot of the time, and recognizing that people still continue to be able to do that, to want to give, to want to be able to share, to want to be able to say, hey, I'm extending an opportunity to be able to build trust, even in the face of being kicked, punched, killed for all of that. And that's actually something that is powerful and multi-generational, and something that has been given to us from all the ancestors to take forward.
I want to highlight this notion of responsibility. Sam, that's a beautiful gift and teaching that you shared with us, because there, in what I hear in that is also that it's our responsibility to evolve, right? I mean, what we're doing, and I come back to, Gay, what you shared, this sort of, how do we generate from heart to community, the through line that is physical? I think that that's the evolution that becomes manifested. So we're constantly in this place of manifesting. And I don't mean to come back, I don't mean to make anything negative, but to come back to the colonial mindset, around metrics and measuring. The truth is, they never paid for our art because it couldn't be paid for. They never paid for it. They never bought it, because you can't put a price tag on me, right? So don't come back to me with a grant now where I get to re-earn the money that was taken away from people who built this community, from people who we've displaced, and we're going to earn it back 1 penny at a time by slicing each other's throats open. Maybe we can say fuck that now. And I mean, the thing that is going to happen is that those 4% of POC-led arts organizations are going to have to undo the sort of vehement embedded neural wiring to go to war with each other, right? We're going to be asked to go to war with each other right now, right? And they're going to watch us like gladiators play it out. And so we have to be mindful of saying, actually, we choose not to operate in this system, and we choose to operate in communal systems. And so, I mean, we come back to the very first question of currency. What do we value? And how do we actually pay for what we need? I mean, and the other thing that I'm saying in the context of this is we spend a lot of time with folks who are in the recovery community. And the recovery community will often say, attraction, not promotion. Attraction, not promotion. Put the good work out there. And you're putting the good work out there in this place of offering and trust. You're putting it out there for you. If you say that you're putting out there for somebody else, that's promotion, right? And one of my colleagues who has a background in death metal, he says that's false metal. That's not the real thing there. Where if you think that, look at me, look how good I am, look how decolonial I am, it's still promotion, right? And so it's to say, like, we don't have to parade how woke we are. We just have to do the fucking work.
Gay, you want to take us home?
Sure. I mean, I feel at home so much with all of you, and I'm so grateful because I'm so, I feel hopeful, inspired. I feel reconnected as well with things that I feel like I should always know, but sometimes they become obscured, So it's great to see all of these feelings show up in the beautiful words and the work that you all are all doing. And I wanted to also answer the question briefly, because I'm so always involved with my students at UCLA and other places too. And I noticed that, as the institution is gunning so hard for us to take the same patterns and pace into remote learning in a moment of tremendous upheaval for so many people, in a moment when students have been let down everywhere. There are opportunities for us to learn and to be healed from all of this terrible violence that the institution is always trying to whip into us with the pace and the narrative of what we're supposed to be, the idea of what's valuable. When we listen to our students, I mean, Sam, you were talking about the youngest people in the community being the ones that are so important. They're the anchors in so many ways. And when I am able to listen to what people need, and be led by my students and what they need, where is it that they're listening from? Not everyone is listening from the safe home that they went home to, where their parents are still earning money, even though they're not actually physically at work. Most of my students who are undocumented are living in incredibly fragile and precarious situations where they're always afraid for their parents, who, and their whole families may have been, at least in part, dependent upon the salary that they themselves get from working in the cafeteria at UCLA, right? And now they can't do that. And the worry that causes for the students, and the expectation then that the institution has, and many professors too, who have been trained into that the students will be able to perform even better in these circumstances, is astounding. And so when I've had the opportunity, which I already have in the past week, talking to students about what do we need, like what exactly is the role of our community and congregation together, because for some reason, out of all the millions of people on the earth, the 100 of us are here together for the next 10 weeks. What do we have? What do we do? Of all the juke joints in all the world, here we are, right? And so what medicine and magic can we make together? And many of them are like, just want to talk together and connect. And we want to talk about what struggle really means. We want to talk about what beauty really is. We want to talk about what art really is. And it's the first time that many of them have that opportunity to do so. But the most important thing they've asked for is can we put a human face on what is happening right now, please? Because I need, in this very fragile situation, I'm sleeping on my friend's couch, and she has a studio, and her daughter is here, and her parents are coming, and I can't listen because I have 2 kids and no childcare. These things are all hardships and also all realities that we have to reckon with. But when you get to ask people, so how can we help each other? It's brilliant. It's incredible what happens then. It's amazing what people are willing to share from themselves and also from their humanity. And so in that I have to answer the question that Quetzal posed with the superpowers for me in this moment, because I'm so involved in education, are my students, especially my undocumented students. And so anyway, I wanted to ask for any last words that folks had. I wanted to give so much appreciation to everyone, and for the music and for the time and the wisdom. But any last thoughts before we end?
I just, picking up on a couple of things. We are part of living culture. So we are the face of our cultures for right now. And in 200 years' time, what is going to change is how we reshape our thinking. Because if we can vision forward to beyond our own mortality, you become a little bit more selfless in that respect. And then you look deeper to say, well, what shifts do we need to do? And on a really practical level, it's the well-being issue, it's the food security issue, it's quality of life for our people, creating a safe space for undocumented individuals so that they can continue to build on their talent, their responsibility, and that we bring everyone forward in that model. It's about sitting still, and I think mindful listening, and sometimes it's listening within yourself, because we're being led through all sorts of levels of media and interaction in a direction of chaos and trauma, and putting that on top of existing chaos and trauma is an untenable situation within itself, because it really pushes you into dark corners and into unsuccessful outcomes, or into, as I said, sedation, in a way in which you're just waiting for them to then, as we've all kind of acknowledged, pick up and say, well, here we are, we're at it again, and we're going to come back really strong. And you go, but wait, we're stronger now because we've been able to kind of sit mindful in our chaos and trauma. And, coming from a pretty low socioeconomic community, a very small community as well. There's 28 groups in our Aboriginal community back home, you get a lot of time to kind of sit with silence and empower silence in a way that is a force to be reckoned with, because quite often they're pushing you for answers and they're pushing you for their compliance, because there's this sense of urgency that they've contrived around a deadline or a timeline. And to actually pull that back and play with power in a much different way, because we can slow things down or we can move things faster. We can sit still and then we can be very active. So we have the ability to play with notions of time and power and shift and change them. But I would propose as a call of action to do that in a way in which we can bring people forward. So again, it's about not leading with your own ego. It's about leading with a different set of values and constructs and being affirmed. You know, you can be very solid on the ground and very resolute in your warrior status in so many ways, and acknowledging that it's often some of the people that you never hear about, who are never at the front line getting the kudos, who are the ones who are the most powerful community organizers on the ground, the voice of the voiceless. How do we empower the voice of the voiceless? Well, you give them the mic. So we need to really, I guess, reframe and step back within ourselves a little bit, but also privilege a whole lot of voice and action to move forward, because the Bureau of Amazing Ideas, as Quetzal knows, is full of the potential and power for other people to come forward and say, well, hey, as you said in your group, you know, how can we all work together? It's looking at the very, you know, individual to the local, to the bigger, to the worldview. And quite often everyone gets stuck at the worldview and goes, well, I'm waiting for the leader, but we're the ones our ancestors have chosen. We're not here for no reason, you know, if we don't choose it to be our way forward. So that's what I'd like to maybe leave, is just the ability to sit in the power of stillness and silence and mindfulness and be as loud as you want to be. You know, dreaming processes, they don't call it in Australia the dream time. It's literally invigorating all of these other abilities, our own internal superpowers, to come up with our own solutions and then propose them in our safe spaces and let other people add value and let other people take that idea forward without the necessary sense of, well, I've now, you know, this is about me, where's my citation? Sometimes some of the best work is the silent work. And know what you can give away and know what you can't as well. That's just where I'm probably at for the moment too. So I'm throw it to everybody else. All right, one more thing, sorry. It's just to kind of wrap that up. Our greatest power now, because we're communities that are just constantly in spaces of turmoil and disenfranchisement and everything, is how we can stay standing still and upright in that, if that's just a visual idea. You know, how do you stand in the middle of the eye of the storm in your own peace, in your own proactive prosperity, and move that forward rather than waiting for someone else to come and make it all better for you, because we know through historical everything that doesn't happen.
EJ, Jeff, any last words?
I have something that we could all sing together at the end, if that would be interesting. It's 2 minutes. It would be a call and response. Maybe a nice way to end. Jeff, if you have any comments that you want to share?
Let's sing.
Let's sing. Okay. So this is a series of affirmations that go go back and forth, and it's helpful. You know, we actually do this for each of the artists office hours, and it's helpful if you don't mind muting yourselves. But I'm hoping that you're all singing your hearts out in response here. This is a song that my wife Rena created for the Skid Row community here in Los Angeles, and it's called "Take What You Need." And so it goes like this. Take a moment, take a breath, take time, take care, take heart, take hope, take a step, take a chance, take courage, take charge, take a stand, take pride, take joy, take pause, take a moment, take a breath, take what you need, take what you need, take what you need. And when we sing this song with communities in Skid Row, they'll always add, take what you need and give the rest back. So take what you need, give the rest back.
Thank you all so much. So this ends our discussion for today. And I really want to thank all of you with deep, deep, deep gratitude and love for spending this time today. You know, it really, it means a lot to me, for sure, to my family, and my son is over there listening and enjoying these moments. I'm just gonna go into the, you know, the thing I got to do at the end here, well, to make sure people are connecting to the Cancel Rent campaign. And so for more information, please go to bit.ly/cancel rent, and you can find more information there, or you can find the demands at bit.ly/beyond recovery demands. You'll see stuff on your screen now, and please, please, please join us, get information, and you know, the different ideas that were being put forth today, the different questions. You know, I mean, one of the things that struck me was Jeff's story about the bagpipes and how important that is. You know, and it reminded me of one of my first adult moments with my father. He was in Chiapas on a Fulbright fellowship studying the organizing methods of women in the Zapatista movement. And I got to spend some time with him in Chiapas. And this is the first time as an adult that I'm really connecting with my dad and, you know, healing some stuff together. And you know, he two things happened. He told me a story about my maternal grandfather. And he's like, man, your grandpa Chema, he knew some shit that I wasn't understanding at the time. He said, you know, he would tell me, we would have discussions about revolution over beers. And he would say, you know, Roberto, if the revolution came, I would die a proud Catholic. And my dad would say, you know, there's no room for religion in the revolution, you know. And my grandpa would say, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about, right? And so they would go back and forth, back and forth. And so then flash forward, and my dad's hanging out with the Zapatistas, and they're all Christians and Catholics. They're indigenous people, and they're all Christians and Catholics, and have been, you know, heavily driven by this faith, and are these wonderful revolutionaries. And so he's like, yeah, I didn't get it till right now, you know, like, what was it, like 50 years later or something like that. And so that was a really beautiful moment. And the other thing he said was like, you know what? He says, you know what I think when I'm hanging out here? He said, love is intrinsically reciprocal. And so that's what I took from your all's discussion today. And thank you so much. And until next time, love you guys so much. All right, I'm gonna